47 cars sat bumper to bumper outside the only entrance to Hollow Ridge Estates, while a county sheriff looped a heavy steel chain through the black iron gate as calmly as if he were locking up a public park at sunset. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Luxury SUVs idled in a line stretching nearly a quarter-mile down the Tulane Road, their drivers staring through windshields at something they never imagined could happen. Standing in front of the crowd, wearing a white blazer that looked far too clean for ranch country, Vanessa Whitmore raised a court order above her head like it settled every argument before anyone else could speak. "This man has no legal right to interfere with HOA property," she shouted loudly enough for dozens of homeowners holding phones to hear. "We already sued him, and the court will force him to reopen this road today." She pointed directly at me as if introducing the villain in a television drama. I kept both hands resting inside my jacket pockets and said nothing. After spending years buying and restoring 2,300 acres beyond the edge of that subdivision, I had learned something simple. The louder someone demanded authority, the more carefully I listened to the paperwork behind the words. One deputy shifted uncomfortably beside the sheriff and glanced from Vanessa's court order to the survey map folded beneath his arm. He looked like a man trying to solve a puzzle that refused to fit together. My attorney, Clara Hayes, stood several yards behind me beside her pickup truck, holding a leather portfolio without saying a single word. She had told me the night before that patience would do more damage than any speech ever could. Vanessa mistook my silence for surrender. Most people did. She turned toward the gathered residents with a confident smile. "By this afternoon," she announced, "Mr. Mercer will no longer control access to this community." Several board members nodded proudly behind her, while a local contractor leaned against his utility truck watching the scene unfold with growing uncertainty. Then the sheriff quietly unfolded another document and looked toward the deputy. "Before we proceed," he said evenly, "I'd like clarification regarding ownership of the access corridor." Vanessa laughed under her breath. "Ownership has already been settled," she replied. "Everyone here knows this road belongs to the HOA." The sheriff didn't answer. Neither did I. Instead, I watched the morning breeze ripple across the pasture beyond the gate, where cattle grazed without the slightest concern for lawsuits, HOA meetings, or expensive promises. Somewhere behind me, Clara closed her portfolio with a soft snap that barely rose above the sound of idling engines. It was the smallest sound anyone heard that morning, but before the sun climbed much higher, it would become the only sound that truly mattered. Vanessa smiled even wider after the sheriff asked his question because she honestly believed there was only one possible answer. Confidence came naturally to people who had never been forced to question their own authority. She lowered the court order just enough for everyone gathered outside the gate to see the county seal across the top page, then slowly turned toward the growing crowd of homeowners. "This," she announced, tapping the paper with one polished fingernail, "is what happens when someone refuses to cooperate with their community." A few residents nodded immediately. Others lifted their phones higher, eager to capture what they assumed would be the final defeat of a stubborn ranch owner. I recognized several faces from previous encounters. Most had never spoken to me directly. They simply accepted whatever the HOA board told them. Vanessa enjoyed that kind of audience. It made certainty look contagious. "Mr. Mercer has blocked maintenance crews, ignored formal notices, and refused every reasonable request made by Hollow Ridge Estates," she continued. "The board has spent months trying to resolve this peacefully." I let her finish without saying a word. Experience had taught me that arguments rarely change people's minds. County records usually do. The contractor standing beside the utility truck shifted his weight and quietly folded his clipboard against his chest. He wasn't looking at Vanessa anymore. His attention stayed fixed on the survey map still resting beneath the deputy's arm. He had probably seen enough construction projects to recognize when something didn't feel quite right. Clara remained silent beside her truck, watching the entire exchange without showing the slightest reaction. Before sunrise, she had reminded me of one simple rule: never interrupt someone who is building your case for you. Every confident statement she made became part of the public record, whether she realized it or not. One member of the HOA board stepped beside her carrying a large subdivision map mounted on foam board. He unfolded it toward the residents with dramatic confidence. Colored property lines stretched across the neighborhood, ending neatly at the entrance road. Vanessa pointed proudly at the illustration. Everything you see here, she said, falls under HOA authority, including this entrance. Several homeowners clapped softly. The deputy, studying his own county survey, didn't join them. Instead, his eyes moved slowly between the board's colorful presentation and the older survey folded in his hands. The sheriff noticed the same hesitation but said nothing. His calm expression never changed. Mine didn't either. The breeze carried the smell of fresh-cut hay across the pasture, while cattle wandered along the fence line completely unaware that dozens of people were arguing over the road beside them. Then one elderly homeowner near the back of the crowd raised his hand and asked a question so ordinary that almost nobody paid attention. If the HOA owns the entrance, he asked politely, why is the county still checking who owns it? For the first time that morning, Vanessa didn't answer immediately, and although the silence lasted only a second, it was long enough for the first seed of doubt to settle quietly into the minds of everyone watching. The question lingered over the entrance road long after the elderly homeowner lowered his hand. Nobody rushed to answer it. Even the people recording with their phones seemed to sense that something small had shifted beneath the conversation. Vanessa recovered first. She gave a polite laugh and waved dismissively toward the sheriff. Standard procedure, she said. The county always verifies property records before enforcement. That's all this is. Several board members immediately nodded in agreement, grateful that someone had supplied an explanation. The sheriff simply looked toward his deputy without confirming or denying her statement. The younger deputy unfolded the county survey another few inches across the hood of his patrol SUV. His finger traced a series of parcel numbers before stopping near the entrance corridor. He frowned slightly, then looked back toward the large presentation map the HOA board had proudly displayed for the crowd. Sheriff, he said quietly, careful not to sound confrontational, these parcel numbers don't appear to match. Vanessa heard him anyway. Because you're looking at an outdated county copy, she answered before anyone else could speak. Our attorneys already submitted the current documents. Clara finally took a slow step forward, though she never interrupted. She simply rested one hand on her portfolio and watched the exchange with the calm expression of someone who had already read every page in the room. I stayed exactly where I was. Years earlier, an old surveyor had given me advice I never forgot. When measurements disagree, let the paper argue before the people do. The contractor standing beside the utility truck cleared his throat and walked a little closer to the deputy. Mind if I see that survey? He asked. The deputy handed it over without hesitation. Contractors spend enough time around property lines to know that mistakes made on paper become very expensive once heavy equipment arrives. The man studied the drawing for less than a minute before his eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. He didn't say what he noticed. Instead, he quietly handed the survey back. That silence caught my attention far more than words would have. Across the line of waiting vehicles, impatient homeowners began stepping out to see why nothing was happening. Engines shut off one after another until the morning became strangely quiet. Somewhere beyond the gate, a meadowlark called from the fence line, the sound carrying across open pasture while everyone else focused on maps and legal documents. Vanessa folded her arms, clearly irritated that the discussion had slowed. She had expected deputies to unlock the gate, not compare paperwork. How much longer is this going to take? She demanded. The sheriff answered with the same steady voice he had used since arriving. As long as it takes to make sure we're standing on the right property. Vanessa rolled her eyes dramatically, convinced the delay was nothing more than government bureaucracy. She had no idea that the deputy's simple observation about two mismatched parcel numbers had just opened the first crack in a lawsuit built on absolute confidence. And before the morning was over, that tiny crack would become impossible for anyone to ignore. The deputy folded the survey with deliberate care, but the question he had raised refused to disappear. Nobody mentioned the mismatched parcel numbers anymore, yet everyone standing outside the gate kept glancing back and forth between the county map and the colorful subdivision display, as if expecting one of them to change. Vanessa noticed it too. She straightened the sleeves of her blazer and stepped closer to the sheriff, lowering her voice just enough to sound patient instead of irritated. Sheriff, she said, this dispute has already been through attorneys. The HOA has invested thousands of dollars resolving this. Surely we're past debating old survey records. The sheriff looked at her politely, without changing expression. "Ma'am," he replied, "ownership isn't determined by confidence. It's determined by records." She smiled again, but this time it looked practiced rather than natural. I had seen that look before. It usually appeared when someone realized a conversation was drifting somewhere they hadn't planned. Clara remained beside her truck, saying nothing. Earlier that morning, before either of us left for the ranch, she had handed me a cup of black coffee and repeated the same instruction for what must have been the 10th time. "Do not volunteer information," she had said. "If they truly believe the entrance belongs to them, let them keep saying it. Every public statement becomes another piece of evidence." At the time, I simply nodded. Standing there now, watching Vanessa confidently explain ownership to deputies and dozens of homeowners, I finally understood exactly why Clara had been so insistent. Every sentence Vanessa spoke committed her a little further to a position she had never actually verified. She believed certainty could replace documentation. That mistake was becoming more expensive by the minute. One member of the HOA board leaned toward Vanessa and whispered something I couldn't hear. She answered with a quick shake of her head before turning back toward the crowd. "There's absolutely nothing to worry about," she announced. "This road has served Hollow Ridge Estates since the community was built. Everyone knows that." The residents seemed reassured by familiar words. People often mistake long use for legal ownership. They aren't the same thing. The contractor quietly walked back toward his truck but didn't start the engine. Instead, he remained where he could still hear the conversation. Experienced contractors know when paperwork deserves more attention than machinery. The deputy unfolded his survey one final time and traced the entrance corridor again with the tip of his pen. He stopped at a handwritten notation near the lower corner, frowned slightly, then looked toward the sheriff without saying a word. The sheriff gave the smallest nod, almost invisible unless you were watching carefully. I noticed it. Clara noticed it too. Neither of us reacted. Vanessa didn't notice anything at all. She was too busy reassuring her board that by lunchtime the lawsuit would be over and the road would officially belong to the HOA forever. Listening to those words, I found myself thinking about a yellowed folder sitting inside Clara's portfolio, one that hadn't been opened all morning. Inside were documents no one on the HOA board even knew existed, and before this day was finished, those forgotten papers would force every confident promise Vanessa had just made to collapse under their own weight. Watching Vanessa promise victory reminded me of something my grandfather used to say whenever a neighbor argued over a fence line. "Land never remembers who talked the loudest," he would tell me while leaning against the tailgate of his old pickup. "It remembers who took care of it." I didn't fully understand those words when I was 12 years old, spending my summers repairing barbed wire fences instead of playing baseball with my friends. Back then, our family owned nothing more than a modest cattle ranch 100 miles west of where I stood now. The place wasn't wealthy, but it taught me lessons no classroom ever could. Every fence post had a purpose. Every creek crossing had a history. Every worn-out dirt road existed because somebody decades earlier needed a way to reach water, cattle, or open pasture. After my grandfather passed away, my father inherited the ranch. He wasn't interested in luxury developments or quick profits. He believed land should be improved, not flipped. Every spring we repaired gates together before branding season. Every fall we cleared fallen trees from the access roads after the first hard storms rolled through. He used to carry an old leather folder behind the seat of his truck. Inside were surveys, tax receipts, handwritten boundary notes, and faded deeds dating back longer than either of us had been alive. As a teenager, I thought it was excessive. Dad always smiled and said, "Someday somebody will question what belongs to this family. When that day comes, memories won't protect you. Paperwork will." Years later, after he passed away, I kept that folder. Not because I expected trouble, but because throwing it away felt like erasing part of him. My career eventually took me into commercial real estate, where I spent decades helping investors purchase large agricultural properties throughout the Southwest. Most people chase shopping centers or office buildings. I preferred ranches. They were honest. The land never pretended to be something it wasn't. About 4 years before this morning outside Hollow Ridge Estates, I learned that an aging rancher named Walter Harlan planned to retire. His family had owned 2,300 acres bordering several growing subdivisions for nearly 80 years. Developers had approached him countless times with offers large enough to change anyone's life. Walter turned them all down. When I finally met him, he wasn't interested in who could pay the highest price. He wanted to know one thing. Will you keep it a ranch? I answered yes before we discussed a single dollar. We spent nearly 3 hours sitting on his porch drinking black coffee while he walked me through old maps spread across a weathered wooden table. He pointed toward ridges, cattle trails, ponds, and fence lines with the confidence of a man who knew every inch of his property by heart. Before I left that afternoon, Walter placed one worn cardboard archive box into the bed of my truck. Everything you'll ever need is in there, he said. Most people only look at the deed. Don't make that mistake. Read all of it. I did exactly that over the following months, page after page, survey after survey, long before anyone named Vanessa Whitmore had ever heard my name. Standing outside the locked entrance now, I found myself thinking about Walter's quiet smile as he watched me drive away that afternoon. At the time, I believed he was simply handing me the history of a ranch. I had no idea he was also handing me the one collection of documents that would someday determine the future of an entire HOA. People standing outside that gate saw 2,300 acres and imagined money. They saw open pasture, timber, rolling hills, and long stretches of untouched ground sitting only a few miles from expensive homes. To them, the ranch looked like an used opportunity waiting for someone with enough confidence to reshape it. They couldn't have been more wrong. The first morning after I officially closed on the property, I drove the entire perimeter before sunrise with nothing but a thermos of black coffee resting on the passenger seat. Mist drifted across the low meadows while white-tailed deer disappeared into the oak trees ahead of my truck. The eastern pasture caught the first light of morning, turning the grass a deep shade of gold that photographs could never quite capture. I stopped near a small creek crossing where generations of cattle had worn smooth tracks into the limestone. Walter had once told me that every ranch has a heartbeat if you stay quiet long enough to hear it. Standing there alone with nothing but birdsong and moving water around me, I finally understood what he meant. My plan was never to build luxury homes or divide the land into smaller parcels. I repaired old fencing one section at a time. I restored neglected water tanks. I rebuilt a weathered barn that had begun leaning after years of heavy storms. Every improvement respected what had already existed instead of replacing it. There was satisfaction in preserving something that had survived decades before I ever arrived. Some weekends local ranchers stopped by with equipment or advice. Other mornings I worked alone until sunset, replacing broken boards, clearing fallen cedar trees from old ranch roads, or checking the windmills that still supplied water to distant grazing fields. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work. The ranch rewarded patience more than speed. Over time, I came to recognize every curve in the access road, every shallow crossing after heavy rain, every fence corner where cattle liked to gather before feeding. Even the entrance road eventually became familiar enough that I noticed the smallest change whenever someone drove across it. That was why the first unauthorized HOA sign caught my attention immediately. It hadn't been there the evening before. Somebody had planted a polished metal sign reading "Community Access" beside my entrance as though repeating those words could somehow rewrite decades of recorded history. I removed it without anger, laid it carefully beside the county road, and went back to repairing a damaged fence. A week later, another sign appeared, then reflective markers, then landscaping stones. Each addition looked small by itself, almost harmless, but together they told a story. Someone had begun treating my property as though it already belonged to someone else. I never responded emotionally because experience had taught me that land disputes rarely begin with bulldozers or lawsuits. They begin with assumptions repeated often enough that people mistake them for facts. Looking back now, standing outside the locked gate while homeowners waited for deputies to settle an argument they barely understood, I realized those little changes had never been random. Every unauthorized sign, every decorative improvement, every casual reference to our entrance had been leading toward this exact morning. Vanessa believed she was fighting over a road. For me, it had never been just a road. It was the first promise I had made to Walter Harlan when I agreed to protect everything that came with those 2,300 acres, and I had no intention of breaking that promise. The first time I realized Hollow Ridge Estates was paying attention to my ranch wasn't because someone crossed a fence or parked where they shouldn't have. It was because a perfectly ordinary envelope arrived in my mailbox on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The return address carried the HOA logo embossed across the corner in dark blue ink. I almost threw it away, assuming it had been delivered to the wrong property. After all, my land had never been part of the subdivision. Curiosity made me open it anyway. Inside was a neatly printed compliance notice informing me that I had 30 days to remove what they described as unauthorized entrance improvements and submit future maintenance plans for HOA approval. I read the letter twice before smiling to myself. They weren't just mistaken about a fence or a sign. They believed they had authority over property that had never belonged to them. I filed the letter inside Walter Harlan's old archive box and went back to replacing broken boards along the western pasture. 2 weeks later, another envelope arrived. This one warned that continued non-compliance could result in escalating fines and legal action. The language sounded polished, probably written by an attorney, but one sentence caught my attention more than anything else. It referred to the entrance road as a permanent community access corridor maintained under HOA authority. Those words stayed with me long after I finished reading. Walter had walked that road with me on the day we closed the sale. He had pointed out drainage culverts, cattle guards, and old survey markers dating back decades. Not once had he mentioned any HOA ownership. I drove to the entrance that same afternoon and noticed something I hadn't seen before. Fresh landscaping had appeared along both sides of the road. Decorative stones outlined the ditch. Small evergreen shrubs had been planted near the gate. None of it had been there the previous month. The improvements looked attractive enough, but nobody had asked permission. A landscaping crew was loading equipment onto a trailer when I arrived. I walked over and asked who had hired them. One of the workers politely handed me a work order with Hollow Ridge Estates printed across the top. The HOA president said this section belongs to the community entrance, he explained. I thanked him, wished the crew a safe afternoon, and drove away without another word. Getting angry with hired workers would have accomplished nothing. They were simply following instructions. That evening, I pulled Walter's archive box onto my kitchen table and began reading through the old documents again, this time much more carefully than before. Deeds led to surveys. Surveys led to boundary notes. Boundary notes led to county plats. Hours slipped by unnoticed as one record connected to another. I wasn't searching for evidence against anyone. I simply wanted to understand why an HOA would confidently maintain land it didn't appear to own. By midnight, I hadn't found the answer. But I had found enough small inconsistencies to convince me of one thing. Hollow Ridge Estates wasn't making a simple mistake. They were operating under an assumption someone had accepted years earlier without ever verifying it. And if that assumption reached a courtroom, the consequences would be much larger than a few landscaping stones beside an old ranch road. The next morning, I drove into the county seat before most businesses opened. Small towns wake up slowly. The coffee shop across from the courthouse had only 3 pickup trucks in the parking lot, and the courthouse flag had just been raised when I walked through the front doors carrying Walter Harlan's archive box. The county recorder's office looked exactly the way it probably had 20 years earlier. Metal filing cabinets lined one wall, framed survey maps hung behind the front counter, and the quiet hum of old document scanners filled the room. A clerk named Susan recognized me from previous property transactions and smiled. Back already? She asked. Need another copy of your deed? I smiled back. Actually, I need the entire history of one road. She raised an eyebrow but disappeared into the records room without another question. About 15 minutes later, she returned with several oversized plat books, digital survey files, and a stack of recorded documents tied together with a faded cotton ribbon. Everything we have goes back to the original ranch, she said. Good luck. I settled into a wooden table near the window and began working through the records one page at a time. Modern property disputes usually begin with recent paperwork. Experienced landowners know better. The oldest documents often explain the newest problems. The original deed transferring the Harlan Ranch into private ownership was remarkably clear. Every boundary followed natural landmarks, fence lines, and surveyed monuments that still existed today. The entrance corridor appeared exactly where Walter had shown it to me. Nothing unusual there. I moved forward through decades of transfers, tax assessments, subdivision filings, and recorded plats. Every survey repeated the same boundary with only minor updates reflecting improved measuring technology. Then I reached the subdivision documents for Hollow Ridge Estates. That's when I slowed down. The neighborhood plat carefully outlined residential lots, common areas, retention ponds, utility easements, and recreational property. Everything looked professionally prepared, but something was missing. The main entrance road appeared on the drawing, yet no ownership transfer accompanied it. I checked again, then a third time. The corridor existed visually, but the legal description skipped over it completely. That wasn't proof of anything by itself. Survey drawings sometimes omitted details later addressed in separate filings. So I requested every easement recorded during the subdivision's development. Susan returned carrying another stack of documents nearly 4 inches thick. Most involved utility companies, drainage systems, electrical service, and water lines. I read every page anyway. Hours passed while sunlight slowly crossed the courthouse floor. By late afternoon, my notebook contained dozens of parcel references connected by arrows and handwritten notes. The deeper I looked, the stranger the pattern became. Every recorded easement crossed my property with proper legal descriptions except one. The entrance corridor. It appeared everywhere people assumed it should exist, and nowhere it actually needed to be. That kind of omission rarely happened by accident. Before leaving, I requested one final document. The original boundary survey completed before the first house in Hollow Ridge Estates was ever built. Susan printed a certified copy and quietly slid it across the table. I unfolded the large survey, traced the entrance corridor with my finger, and stopped at a handwritten notation tucked beside an old survey monument. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't highlighted. Most people probably would have overlooked it entirely. But the moment I read those few forgotten words, I realized the answer had been sitting inside the county records all along, waiting for someone patient enough to notice what everyone else had assumed instead of proving. I stared at the handwritten notation for several minutes before I reached for my notebook. It wasn't the kind of discovery that made headlines or ended lawsuits overnight. In fact, most people would have dismissed it as nothing more than an old surveyor's remark written in fading ink decades earlier. But experienced surveyors rarely wrote unnecessary notes. Every word had a reason. The notation referred to the entrance corridor as an existing ranch access route, followed by a short reference directing future surveyors to a separate recorded instrument. That immediately caught my attention because I had already reviewed every deed transferring ownership of the Harlan Ranch. None of them mentioned a separate instrument affecting the entrance road. I walked back to Susan's desk and slid the survey across the counter. "Can you help me locate this recording reference?" I asked. She adjusted her reading glasses and studied the faded handwriting for a few seconds before typing the number into the county database. The computer searched through archived records for nearly a minute. Finally, a single entry appeared. It had been recorded more than 30 years earlier, years before Hollow Ridge Estates even existed. Susan frowned slightly. "That's odd," she said quietly. "I've never seen anyone request this file." A few minutes later, she returned carrying a thin folder that looked almost forgotten compared to the thick stacks of subdivision documents covering my table. Inside were only a handful of pages. There was no dramatic language, no courtroom order, no bold legal warning. Instead, the file documented a temporary access arrangement created while county road improvements were being completed many years ago. It explained why construction traffic had been permitted to cross part of the ranch during a limited period under specific conditions. One sentence near the bottom stood out immediately. The permission described in the document was conditional and subject to separate ownership rights. I read that sentence 3 times. It didn't answer every question, but it changed the direction of my investigation completely. Someone, somewhere along the line, appeared to have confused temporary permission with permanent ownership. Those are 2 very different things under property law. I resisted the temptation to draw conclusions too quickly. Assumptions had probably created this entire dispute in the first place. I wasn't about to repeat the same mistake. Instead, I made copies of every page, thanked Susan for her patience, and carried the folder back to my truck. Before starting the engine, I called Clara. She answered on the second ring. "Did you find something?" she asked. "Maybe," I replied. "Not enough to win anything, but enough to know we're asking the right questions." There was a brief silence before she spoke again. "Good," she said calmly. Because if they built their lawsuit on the same assumption you're describing, they may have overlooked the one document that actually matters. I looked through the courthouse window at the old records room one last time. Somewhere inside those shelves was still one missing piece that connected every survey, every deed, and every confident claim Vanessa had made. Until I found it, I wasn't interested in proving anyone wrong. I was interested in understanding why an entire HOA seemed so certain about a right they had never bothered to verify. 3 days after leaving the courthouse, the first certified letter arrived. It wasn't addressed from Hollow Ridge Estates directly. Instead, it came from a law firm representing the HOA board. Thick cream-colored paper, polished legal language, and enough bold lettering to make the average homeowner nervous. According to the attorney, I was interfering with established community operations by removing HOA property, denying maintenance access, and creating what they described as an unreasonable burden on neighborhood residents. They demanded immediate compliance, restoration of the entrance landscaping, and written confirmation that I would no longer obstruct HOA activities. The deadline was 5 business days. I read every page carefully before placing it beside Walter Harlan's archive box. Then I called Clara. She laughed softly after finishing the final paragraph. Interesting, she said. They're making ownership claims without attaching a single recorded instrument. Should we respond? I asked. Not yet, she replied. Sometimes the fastest way to learn how weak someone's position is to let them explain it further. She was right. Over the following 2 weeks, the HOA became noticeably more aggressive. Bright orange notices appeared at the entrance road warning contractors that unauthorized vehicles could be fined. Security guards began photographing every truck entering my ranch. Board members filed complaints with the county claiming I had created a hazardous traffic situation by questioning community access rights. None of the complaints resulted in enforcement, but that didn't seem to discourage Vanessa. If anything, each unanswered complaint convinced her to push harder. One Saturday morning, I arrived at the entrance to find a heavy steel swing gate stretched across my own ranch road. A brand new keypad had already been installed beside the post. Above it hung another polished sign: residents and authorized community vehicles only. The workmanship was excellent. The legal authority behind it was another matter entirely. A private security supervisor stepped forward carrying a clipboard. Sir, he said politely, the HOA has instructed us to restrict unauthorized access until the legal dispute is resolved. I looked past him at the cattle pasture beyond the gate where my fencing crew was already waiting to begin repairs scheduled weeks earlier. Who authorized construction on this parcel? I asked. He hesitated. The HOA attorney provided written approval. I nodded once. I'd recommend keeping a copy of that letter. The man looked confused, but I wasn't speaking to intimidate him. Contractors and security personnel usually rely on instructions from people they trust. They aren't responsible for verifying title records. Vanessa arrived less than 20 minutes later in her white SUV, stepping out with the same confidence she had displayed outside the sheriff's gate. You should have settled this when we offered, she said, folding her arms. Now our attorneys are handling everything. I simply looked at the newly installed gate without answering. She mistook my silence for defeat again. Before leaving, she announced loudly enough for both the security staff and several nearby residents to hear that the HOA would soon obtain a permanent court order transferring complete control of the entrance corridor. She sounded absolutely certain. What she didn't realize was that every complaint, every certified letter, every public announcement, and now even the unauthorized gate itself was quietly creating a timeline far more valuable than any argument Clara or I could have made. Somewhere inside that growing stack of paperwork was the moment Hollow Ridge Estates crossed a legal line they didn't even know existed. And once we identified exactly when it happened, the entire dispute would begin moving in a very different direction. The unauthorized gate stayed in place for less than a week before Clara called and asked me to meet her at the county recorder's office again. Her voice sounded calm, but after working with her long enough, I knew calm usually meant she had found something worth paying attention to. When I arrived, she already had several certified copies spread across one of the large wooden tables. Beside them sat an elderly title examiner named Richard Collins, a man who had spent more than 35 years tracing ownership histories across 3 counties. Richard adjusted his reading glasses and tapped a yellow legal pad covered with handwritten notes. "You've both been looking at the wrong question," he said quietly. Clara looked at me and smiled slightly. "Go ahead," she said. Richard slid one document toward me. It wasn't a deed. It wasn't an easement. It was a closing package from the original developer who built Hollow Ridge Estates more than 2 decades earlier. Buried inside hundreds of routine pages sat a short memorandum discussing the subdivision's future entrance. According to the memo, the developer intended to purchase the existing ranch access corridor from Walter Harlan after construction reached its final phase. I looked up immediately. Intended. Richard nodded. That's the important word. He opened another certified file and placed it beside the first one. There's no recorded purchase. Clara quietly added another document to the table. No deed transferring ownership. Richard added another. No recorded permanent easement. Clara placed one final certified search report beside the others. And no county filing showing the transaction was ever completed. The room fell silent for several seconds. The developer had planned to secure permanent legal access, but somewhere between planning and completion, the paperwork simply stopped. Houses were built. Residents moved in. The HOA eventually took control of the neighborhood. Over the years, everyone continued using the same entrance road until assumptions slowly replaced documentation. Nobody questioned it because nobody had reason to. Richard leaned back in his chair. "I've seen this happen before," he said. One generation assumes the previous generation finished the paperwork. 50 years later, people start believing assumptions are facts. Clara folded her hands together. "That explains discovery number 1, she said. Temporary access became permanent in everyone's memory. I nodded, slowly while studying the developer's unfinished file. Something still bothered me. If the purchase had never happened, why had no one discovered it during every property transaction that followed? Richard answered before I even asked. Because title searches usually focus on the parcel being sold, he explained. Nobody thought to examine land they believed already belonged to someone else. I carefully gathered the certified copies into a single folder. For the first time since this dispute began, the pieces were beginning to fit together. We still didn't have the one document that would end the lawsuit, and Clara reminded me not to celebrate too early. This tells us what never happened, she said as we walked toward the courthouse exit. Now we need the one record proving exactly what did. I looked back once at the recorder's office before closing the folder. Somewhere inside Walter Harlan's archive box and the county's forgotten records, one final piece was still waiting, and until we found it, Vanessa Whitmore would continue believing the entrance road belonged to her community when, in reality, she had built her entire legal strategy on a transaction that had never existed. Clara didn't call Vanessa. She didn't send a threatening letter or demand another meeting. Instead, she prepared a single certified notice addressed to Hollow Ridge Estates, their attorney, and the county recorder. The language was polite, almost understated. It simply requested that the HOA produce the recorded deed, permanent easement, or any other legal instrument establishing ownership or exclusive control of the entrance corridor within 72 hours. If such documentation existed, we would gladly review it. If it did not, the county should be informed before any further enforcement actions continued. That was all. No accusations. No arguments. Just one reasonable request backed by county procedure. Clara slid the envelope across her desk and smiled. People who actually own property rarely fear proving it, she said. The people who don't usually respond with emotion. She was right again. Less than 24 hours after the notices were delivered, Hollow Ridge Estates. Attorney replied with another sharply worded letter. It accused me of delaying the legal process, interfering with community operations, and attempting to intimidate the HOA through technicalities. What it did not include was a single recorded deed, easement, or ownership document. Clara read the response twice before placing it beside the others. They're answering every question except the one we asked, she observed quietly. Meanwhile, the county recorder acknowledged receiving our certified notice and flagged the entrance corridor file, pending verification of ownership records. That administrative step seemed minor, but it changed everything. From that moment forward, county officials could no longer assume the HOA's public claims were accurate without checking the record themselves. 2 days later, I received a phone call from the sheriff. His voice remained calm and professional. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "before we execute anything related to this dispute, My office would appreciate certified copies of the documents your attorney referenced. I told him Clara had already prepared them. Good, he replied. I'd rather answer questions now than make mistakes later. That single sentence told me more than he probably intended. Law enforcement wasn't choosing sides. They were making sure they stood on the correct side of the law before acting. Exactly as they should. Vanessa, however, interpreted the delay very differently. She announced during a special HOA meeting that the county was merely slowing down routine paperwork and assured residents the final court hearing would permanently secure community ownership of the entrance road. Several homeowners applauded. Others appeared relieved. She spoke with complete confidence because she still believed the missing documents simply hadn't been located yet. She never considered the possibility they had never existed. Clara spent that same evening organizing every certified record in chronological order, from Walter Harlan's earliest surveys to the unfinished developer memorandum and the county recorder's latest acknowledgement. She placed each document into labeled folders with colored tabs marking the exact sequence of events. Looking across her conference table, she finally closed the last binder and looked at me. The trap isn't built with surprises, she said softly. It's built with patience. Tomorrow they'll walk into court expecting another argument. Instead, they're going to meet 30 years of paperwork that has been waiting for someone to read it in the right order. The courtroom was quieter than I expected. There were no raised voices, no dramatic speeches, and no last-minute surprises waiting outside the doors. Just a county judge, 2 attorneys, several HOA board members, a handful of curious residents, and the same stack of certified documents Clara had spent days organizing. Vanessa Whitmore entered with the same confidence she had carried since the morning she first waved her court order outside the gate. She smiled politely toward her attorney before taking a seat without ever looking in my direction. As far as she was concerned, this hearing existed for one reason: to force me to surrender control of the entrance road. The judge began by reviewing the HOA's complaint. Their attorney argued that Hollow Ridge Estates had maintained, improved, and exclusively managed the entrance corridor for years, making it an essential part of the community. He referenced landscaping expenses, maintenance invoices, security contracts, and years of uninterrupted public use. It sounded convincing. When he finished, the judge turned toward Clara. "Counsel," he asked. Clara stood without rushing. She walked to the evidence table carrying only a single binder instead of the dozen folders surrounding her chair. "Your Honor," she began calmly, "everything opposing counsel described may be true. The HOA maintained the road. They landscaped it. They installed security equipment. They even believed they controlled it. None of those actions, however, transferred legal ownership." She handed the binder to the court clerk. "The question before this court is not who used the road. The question is who owns it." The first document was the original Harlan Ranch deed, recorded decades before Hollow Ridge Estates existed. It clearly described the entrance corridor as part of the ranch parcel, now legally owned by me. The second document was every subsequent deed transferring the property, each repeating the exact same legal description without removing the corridor. The third was the certified title search Richard Collins had prepared, confirming that no deed conveying the entrance road to the developer, the HOA, or any successor had ever been recorded. The fourth document was the developer's own memorandum acknowledging its future intention to purchase the corridor after construction, a purchase that county records proved never occurred. Finally, Clara presented the oldest certified boundary survey, complete with the handwritten notation directing future surveyors to the temporary construction access agreement. She paused before reading the final paragraph aloud. The agreement granted limited permission for construction traffic only during subdivision development. It specifically stated that the arrangement created no permanent ownership interest and remained subject to the underlying property owner's rights unless replaced by a separately recorded conveyance. Clara looked toward the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "that replacement was never recorded because it never happened." The courtroom became completely silent. The HOA attorney flipped rapidly through his own files before quietly lowering them onto the table. Vanessa leaned toward him and whispered something urgently. He didn't answer. Instead, he slowly shook his head. The judge reviewed each certified document one by one, comparing parcel numbers, recording dates, and legal descriptions. After several long minutes, he closed the final binder and looked directly at the HOA attorney. Can you produce a recorded deed, easement, or conveyance contradicting these records? The attorney remained standing for a moment before giving the smallest shake of his head. No, Your Honor. The judge nodded once. Then the county records established that the entrance corridor has remained part of Mr. Mercer's property throughout every recorded transfer. Long-term maintenance does not transfer ownership, and assumptions cannot replace a recorded deed. This court recognizes Mr. Mercer as the lawful owner of the access corridor. For the first time since this dispute began, Vanessa's confidence disappeared completely. She had spent months believing the law was on her side. In less than 15 minutes, 30 years of forgotten paperwork proved that the legal advantage had belonged to the ranch all along. Nobody rushed out of the courtroom after the judge finished speaking. In fact, the silence lasted longer than the ruling itself. The HOA attorney quietly gathered his files without saying another word. Vanessa Whitmore remained frozen in her chair, staring at the certified surveys spread across the evidence table as though another answer might suddenly appear between the pages. It never did. The judge signed the final order confirming the county's findings, then looked toward the sheriff seated near the rear of the courtroom. "Sheriff," he said calmly, "the county recognizes Mr. Mercer as the lawful owner of the entrance corridor. Any enforcement related to that property shall proceed consistent with today's ruling." The sheriff stood, nodded respectfully, and replied with only 2 words. "Understood, Judge." There was no celebration, no applause, just professionals carrying out the law. Less than an hour later, a small convoy left the courthouse. The sheriff drove in front, followed by 2 deputy vehicles, a county survey truck, and my pickup with Clara riding beside me. News of the hearing had already spread through Hollow Ridge Estates. By the time we reached the entrance, dozens of homeowners had gathered beside the gate. Some stood on sidewalks holding their phones. Others remained beside golf carts parked along the boulevard. Vanessa's white SUV was already waiting near the security kiosk. She stepped forward the moment the sheriff climbed out of his vehicle. "This is ridiculous," she protested. "The community depends on this entrance." The sheriff removed a folded copy of the court order from his folder before speaking. "Ma'am, today's order confirms ownership of the corridor. Until lawful access is established through agreement or recorded legal authority, the county cannot recognize the HOA's claim of control." Vanessa looked toward the deputies. "Tell him. This road belongs to the community." Neither deputy answered. One deputy instead walked with the county surveyor toward the original monument marker buried beside the entrance. The surveyor uncovered the weathered brass cap, verified the coordinates against the certified survey, and quietly nodded. "Property line confirmed," he said. The sheriff reviewed the signed court order one final time before speaking quietly with the county surveyor. After the surveyor confirmed the boundary marker matched the certified survey on file, the sheriff instructed the deputies to document every unauthorized improvement attached to Mr. Mercer's property. Only after the photographs and measurements were completed did the deputies remove the HOA access sign and disconnect the electronic lock in accordance with the court's order. Nobody argued. Everything was documented. Everything was recorded. Vanessa watched in disbelief as months of certainty disappeared one photograph at a time. Then came the moment nobody in Hollow Ridge Estates expected. The sheriff addressed the assembled residents rather than the board. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in the same calm voice he had used all morning, "this community has legal access concerns that must now be resolved through proper negotiation with the property owner. I encourage everyone to direct future questions to your HOA board and legal counsel." The words landed harder than any accusation could have. Homeowners slowly turned toward Vanessa. One elderly resident raised the same question he had asked outside the gate days earlier. "Did we ever actually own this road?" Vanessa opened her mouth but couldn't answer. Another homeowner stepped forward holding a folder of HOA due statements. "We've been paying maintenance fees for property the HOA didn't own." A third resident asked why the board had approved expensive security upgrades without verifying the deed. The questions kept coming, each one louder than the last, yet nobody shouted. They didn't have to. The facts were already speaking for themselves. Several board members quietly slipped away toward the parking lot, avoiding eye contact with their own neighbors. Even the HOA attorney left without offering another explanation. Clara stood beside me, watching the conversation spread through the crowd. Interesting, she said softly. Nobody's angry at you. She was right. Every frustrated face was turned toward the people who had promised ownership without ever proving it. The contractor who had installed the unauthorized gate slowly approached me with his cap in his hands. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "my crew will remove everything before sunset if you'll allow us." I nodded once. "I know you were hired to do a job." He thanked me and walked back toward his truck. By late afternoon, the decorative HOA signs were gone. The keypad had been removed. Fresh survey flags marked the true boundary exactly where they had always been. Residents drove home in complete silence, passing the same entrance they had used for years, but now seeing it differently for the first time. Hollow Ridge Estates hadn't collapsed because someone outsmarted them. It collapsed because the truth finally arrived before the paperwork did, and once the county, the court, the sheriff, and the deputies all recognized the same recorded facts, the illusion of authority disappeared in front of the very people who had believed it most. About 6 weeks after the court hearing, life around the ranch had settled back into the kind of quiet I had hoped for when I bought those 2,300 acres. The temporary survey flags had been replaced by permanent boundary markers installed by the county. The unauthorized gate, keypad, and HOA signs were long gone. Fresh gravel covered the entrance road where construction crews had carefully repaired the damage left behind during the dispute. Every morning, I still drove the same familiar route with a thermos of black coffee resting beside me, watching the sun rise over the eastern pasture exactly as it had before lawyers, court orders, and HOA meetings interrupted ordinary life. The cattle never cared who won the lawsuit. They simply wandered toward the creek each morning like they always had. In a strange way, I found that comforting. Land has a way of reminding people that most arguments are temporary. Seasons keep changing regardless. Hollow Ridge Estates changed too. The board quietly announced Vanessa Whitmore's resignation before the next monthly meeting. A newly elected president mailed me a short handwritten letter requesting a conversation rather than another legal notice. Clara joined me when we met inside the community clubhouse a few days later. There were no raised voices this time. No accusations. Just neighbors trying to solve a problem that should have been addressed correctly years earlier. Over the next several weeks, attorneys for both sides negotiated a permanent recorded easement that respected my ownership while guaranteeing lawful access for the homeowners. Every revision was reviewed, signed, and officially recorded with the county before the agreement took effect. That was exactly how Walter Harlan would have wanted it handled. A few weekends later, I found myself standing near the entrance road watching children ride bicycles through the neighborhood while ranch trucks rolled peacefully toward the western pasture. Nothing about that scene required another courtroom. Good paperwork had accomplished what arguments never could. Before leaving, one of the newer HOA board members walked over and thanked me for agreeing to the easement instead of forcing another fight. I smiled and told him something my father used to say whenever someone admired an old fence that had survived another hard winter. Good neighbors begin with clear property lines. He laughed quietly and admitted he would probably remember that for a long time. So would I? Every now and then I still open Walter Harlan's archive box sitting on the shelf inside my study. The papers look older each year, but they haven't become any less important. Those faded surveys, recorded deeds, handwritten notes, and forgotten documents protected far more than a ranch. They protected a promise. They reminded me that ownership isn't measured by the volume of someone's opinion or the confidence of an HOA meeting. It's measured by responsibility, patience, and the willingness to preserve something worth passing on. And every time I drive through that entrance road beneath the wide Texas sky, I remember that the strongest thing a property owner can ever carry isn't a louder voice. It's the truth, properly recorded, waiting quietly for the day someone finally takes the time to read it.